Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the State Water Survey, and today is our webinar, Well Care 101, What You Need to Know to Protect Your Family. The State Water Survey at the University of Illinois is one of the state scientific surveys, like our State Geological Survey, Natural History Survey, and our role in all of this is, part of our job is to help well owners in the state of Illinois. Through this program, which is funded by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership and US EPA, we're able to develop this private well class, this program. And as I'll talk about later, the class is actually 10 lessons that you receive through email online. This webinar is in support of those lessons, and they're much more detailed there. If you haven't taken the actual paper class from the material we send through email, I encourage you to do that, and I'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. So moving on, first thing, these classes are available for CEUs, and we work with NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association. They also have a version of our class, all 10 lessons, on their website. That's free for any sanitarian or environmental health professional to take. And so their credentialing cycle is a 2-year cycle. And so that means basically, we did this webinar, you can see down the bottom right, the times we've done this very similar webinar. The core content's the same, some of the questions at the end are different. And so if you've taken this already on either last April or the September before, then you can't get credit for it again if you're in the same credentialing cycle. So for instance, if your credentialing cycle for NEHA started this month, 8/1/19, then after today, you couldn't take our Well Care 101 class again until after 7/31/21. We are in Illinois, and so we are an LEHP provider for Illinois, and that's available as well. Okay. So as far as this class goes, it's part of a national program that's funded through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and it's funding they receive from EPA, and we're a grantee to RCAP, and we developed this program together. So it does follow our class, and this is the material we'll cover today. It is part of helping you understand your well. There's a lot more detail. If you go to privatewellclass.org, you can see where to sign up via email for the class itself. And this webinar, as well as all the other webinars we do, are recorded, and it'll be available on YouTube in a few business days after today. And you are all given an opportunity to ask questions when you signed up for this webinar, and we received a lot of them, and we'll answer some of those today. We can't do them all, but we also, Katie's monitoring the question box on your GoToWebinar panel. And if something comes up today and you have another question you want to ask, she will keep track of those, and we'll go through those at the end for those that want to stay around and get answers, or depending on how long this takes. It's meant to be 90 minutes. Sometimes it's done a little early. Sometimes it's done quite a bit later, depending on the questions we get and the interest from all of you. So I do want to mention none of this would be possible, again, without RCAP or the US EPA. And this program is really based on trying to help well owners understand their wells, why they need to take care of it, and all the source water protection issues that go along with that, as well as public health issues for your safe drinking water. So a little bit about RCAP really quick. So they are the main player in all of this, as far as this funding goes to RCAP and then a number of sub-grantees, including the National Groundwater Association, the Water Systems Council, NEHA, and us. And but each of the RCAP regions, which are listed here on this map, have staff in every state, and they not only put on workshops for well owners, but also for sanitarians and other stakeholders. And we have an assessment program, which I'm really not going to talk about today, but if you have questions about your well, someone from RCAP can come out and work with you and take a look at your situation, the geology, find your well log if there is one, if you don't have it, and provide guidance through this assessment tool we developed in order to help you better understand your well and what you need to do. So they can provide recommendations on things that maybe you're doing well or not doing well, what you need to do regularly to maintain your well, and it's a free service funded through this program. So if you need any of these contacts, you can also email us, and we can give you a contact, or we can give them your name, and they can follow up with you, one of the other RCAPs, or one of the regions, and we provide them names almost every day, it seems like. So we're glad that they're available, boots on the ground, to do all this work. So today we're just going to talk about the basics of well care, how to ensure your well safe, and some maintenance issues. As I mentioned, we've received a lot of questions, and so on the call with me today is Katie Buckley, who's our outreach specialist, and she's going to be fielding the questions on the question box or the chat box today. And Dan Webb is the head of our public service lab, and he'll be answering some of the questions at the end and anything you might ask today that's related to water quality. So our public service lab offered free water sampling for inorganics and metals to any well owner in Illinois as a taxpayer-funded service until 2006 or 8, I believe. And now there's a nominal fee for that because of the state budget and the way it's been. But we, the role of the public service lab is to help well owners in Illinois. Dan is actually a well owner himself, which really helps a lot. And so he is, a great resource for you all and for me for this program. So the water survey, I believe Oklahoma just started a water survey, but other than that, no other state has one. I'm not sure why. I guess their services are rolled up into other agencies, but the water survey in Illinois was started in the 1890s because of water quality issues related to cholera and typhoid. And since then, we're a sister agency to our State Geological Survey, Natural History Survey, and Archaeological Surveys. And we're all housed under one umbrella on the campus of the University of Illinois under the Prairie Research Institute. So we house the state's well logs. So every well that's drilled has to be permitted in Illinois. They come to us after they've gone to the counties. And so we have a repository with about 500,000 well logs dating back into actually before the 1890s. And we also, again, have our public service lab, and we do a lot of applied research and outreach, and as well as we're kind of the scientific arm of the state to help communities with their water issues, which there are a number of right now going on. As an example, going back through our files, this is a map of Pana, Illinois in 1916, and water survey scientists were involved in investigating a typhoid outbreak then, and it was eventually traced to the Pana Ice Cream Company. I don't know any of the other details there. I'd have to go back and look, but one of our staff was looking through some old records and found this, and we've uncovered, it's amazing the work that was done back then, given the tools they had compared to today. And so it's just an example. We've been in this business for a long time and really have a good sense of what's going on, especially in the state of Illinois. So today, kind of as an overview, things you need to understand if you're a well owner. I know we had several questions from people who said, I'm a brand new well owner, I don't know anything about my well. So this is a good start for that. Private wells aren't regulated. It's up to the owner and user to be sure the water is safe to drink and the system is maintained. By that I mean the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates community water supplies or public water supplies. They're required to meet certain conditions. If you've ever heard the term MCL, a maximum contaminant level, for instance, for arsenic, that's 10. For bacteria, that's a presence of any, E. coli or coliform. Not being regulated means as a well owner or a user, you need to be sure you're testing your well to make it safe, and that's one of the things we'll really stress today, because you're really the operator of a very small water system. And you can't go by taste or odor or color. Sometimes like color, like tannins, I know there was a question about that in one of our webinars, which may cause kind of a yellow color, or there's a lot of sulfur smells and things. Those things aren't health concerns. They're just nuisance and aesthetic concerns. So you can't go by those things. If you have arsenic at 200 ppb in your water, you're not going to smell it, taste it, or see it. So you need to test. And the other part of this is, I grew up on an old dug well. I talk about it a lot. 14 foot deep. It was hand dug by my grandpa in 1933. It was in a ravine in the middle of our cow pasture. It just totally was not safe, but they always felt it was a good place to get water. So that's your responsibility as a well owner. Now, I live in a community with a community water supply, and I pay $40 to $50 a month for water, and that's spread out among, I said 150,000 residents. That's probably closer to 50,000 homes that all pay a monthly fee to make sure that there's always safe water coming out of the tap, there's always good water pressure, and that someone's maintaining the system and the infrastructure so that I will always have water. That's your job as a well owner. So, and I added this. This hasn't been on our webinar before. This last bullet I think is really important because we've done this now for the last 5 or 6 years. It's not PFAS or lead or any other emerging thing that's in the news today. The two things that are really the cause the most problems with private wells are old wells, really, poor well construction. Because I think in every state, when well construction code gets changed or amended or updated, any wells that already exist aren't required to update. So like that hand dug well, we run across a lot of them. They're still acceptable to use as a water supply. And so poor well construction leads to surface contamination of your well. And the other thing is just lack of knowledge. So many well owners come to us and can't tell us where their pump's set, what kind of well it is, if it's drilled or a dug or bored well, how deep it is, and no information about the geology, never been tested. And that's what we're here for, is to help you understand why doing those things is the most important part of understanding your well. Just even taking our class, what I tell people is it'll help you ask better questions when you have a problem, because you'll understand the basics of what it means to be a well owner, how your well works, how water gets in your well. All of those things matter. And if you don't have a good understanding of that, you're not nearly as helpful to the person you hire or the health department you contact because you have some kind of issue. So we can correct that, right? Both those things, if everyone understands why it's important. So as far as well considerations, we're going to get into some of the issues here now. In general, well depth, deeper is generally better. And I say that from the standpoint of, I grew up on a 14-foot hand dug well. When it rained hard, our water was cloudy, which means surface water is getting into our well, which is a bad thing. It brings with it bacteria or other things that you may not want from the surface. And so a deeper well that's properly constructed should be safer, especially a sand and gravel well where the screen is only in the bottom 4 or 5 feet of that well. So a 200-foot sand and gravel well is getting its water from 195 to 200, which means anything at the surface has to go through 195 feet of material to even get to the screen to get in the well where you're going to pump it out. Versus a bedrock well, deeper is still maybe better, but it really depends on the amount of casing that's there. A 200-foot bedrock well could have 150 feet of casing. It could have 30 feet of casing because in a bedrock well, you don't case the bedrock. You leave it open so you can take advantage of the fractures in the rock to get so water can get in. So you need to understand those things, what kind of well you have, how much casing you have, goes along with that. And the other caveat to well depth is there are places where in a deeper aquifer you may have a natural occurring contaminant, radium, uranium, arsenic. And so that's what your local experts are for, your health department, your extension, and even your state, water survey, geological survey, DNR, whatever agency studies your aquifers and geology, because if it's there, they'll know it. So the other considerations are location on the landscape. If you're down in a bottom near a creek or a river, your well, that's susceptible to flooding, or it may be influenced by the water from a river or stream, then that's less safe than where if you're on a high spot where there's never going to be a flooding issue, your well isn't tapping the same geologic unit that might be connected to a river, lake, or stream, all those sorts of things. So understanding that. And groundwater flow direction, the best example I can give of this is if you're in a rural subdivision out in the country and it's near a water body like a river, and you're the farthest away from the river and you're at the highest elevation for your house and well, then the water table is flowing likely towards the river. So if everyone has really shallow wells, or say bored wells, because that's the only option you have, then likely the water's flowing from away from the river towards the river. And so if you're that last house right before the river, everything that happens up gradient of you could be affecting your well, including everybody else's septic. So knowing the flow direction, which sometimes isn't possible to come across, but other times it is, you can determine where your water's coming from, so that if there are other influences, even several miles away, the groundwater is always flowing. It doesn't sit still. So eventually that water that's under one location is going to end up at another. And so it's important to know that as far as just getting an idea of where it's coming from. And then the area surrounding your well. There's common sense things. You don't store chemicals near your well. You don't plant trees near your well. You want to keep it free and available so that you can, pull the pump if it's a submersible pump. And also, you don't have things that you're doing around the well that, could get into the ground and eventually affect your well. So, we find wells in all kinds of crazy places, in people's houses, in their basements, under their garage. Those are not good places to have your well. And understanding that it's a resource, and it's also an investment, and it costs a lot to replace, so you need to take care of it. So about correcting poor construction, as I mentioned, construction codes have changed. Illinois created their construction codes in the late 60s. Some states, a lot of states, it was in the 80s. A few states not till nearly 2000, which means before that, even if those codes weren't perfect, people were doing whatever, just like the well I grew up on. It was done by my grandfather, and it's just not safe. And then even as those codes have changed to be more protective, I know the Illinois well code has changed a number of times. We still have those old wells that are in place because they were grandfathered in. Wells used to exist in pits, especially in cold climates, so that the pipes didn't freeze. Well, those are really a risk, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So if you do have a well in a pit, you should bring the casing up to the top of the ground, fill it all in. They harbor, and during storms or whatever, they can fill up with water. They can overtop your well. We know that wells that are overtopped by water are much more likely to get contaminated with bacteria, those sorts of things. And so, the advent of the pitless adapter, which I believe was in the late 60s as well, makes it unnecessary to have a pit today. And so they really should go away. And there are many old hand dug wells still in use. We find them everywhere. I was just in North Carolina at a conference for the Environmental Health Association, and some of the pictures of some of the wells they showed, they're 100-year-old wells, and they work fine, but they're not protective at the surface. So, and again, they provide not only an opportunity for contamination, but they can also be a safety hazard. Here's some examples of 3 wells that I would consider unsafe. The upper left one is a picture of where the plywood had broken and the person who lived there fell to her death. This comes from the Washington State Department of Ecology, their blog. They are the agency in the state of Washington that regulates drillers and well construction. You can see here, though, even when that plywood was over top of that well, and that concrete block, I'm assuming, was over that hole, you've got some old insulation laying around. There's a funnel and a broom. There's probably mice in there. A lot of stuff falls in there. You can see a piece of the old plywood hanging off, almost falling into the well. That's just not safe, and a mouse falls in there, and it's a problem all by itself. So just not safe, not a way to have your water supply. And the picture on the upper right, Don Kelberman was down in Southern Illinois investigating his family roots. I ran into him when I was down there at a meeting, and he took this picture of an old brick well that's on an old family property, and that's a dead goat. And so you find these things all the time. You can't make it up. Truth is stranger than fiction. And this last picture, my boss, Walt Kelly, who's the head of our groundwater section, we did a study of all the dug and bored wells in an area in Illinois where we sampled quarterly and did a bunch of work. And this well is, on the side of a hill. You can see how it's kind of muddy on the lower right side. That's because that's a cattle pasture, and that's why those posts look so worn down, because the cows come over and rub on those posts, the scratching posts. But it's just got 2x6s and 2x10s with tin over top of that and some concrete blocks holding it down. Snakes, rats, a lot of things can get in there, and especially they try to find places where there's cover. And so just completely not a safe water supply. So what do? You should bring these up to code as best you can. Now, sometimes meeting every piece of the code, like we run into wells sometimes that aren't 18 inches above land surface, like our code says they should be, or some states' codes do. Maybe they're only 12 inches. But you tell people then to assess the situation. Is it likely that a spot's going to flood? That's what it's really for, is to make sure the well doesn't get overtopped. And maybe you don't need to do some of those things. But if you have a pit or an old dug well, there's things you can do. You can cap it 10 feet below land surface and then put a riser pipe that looks like a drilled well pipe up to the surface, and then fill that all in with clay, or fill in the pit with clay. And so, talk to a well authority, your county, or, a contractor, and see what they suggest or what they might be able to do for you. Because it's just, we run into folks all the time who say, well, I get bacteria in my well all the time. It's, no matter when I test, it seems to blah, blah, blah. Well, that means that you've got a source, and you need to change your well, or find a different well, or add continuous disinfection. Those are your options. So as far as abandoned wells, that's another big issue. Since well logs weren't required until at least the 60s, and in some areas, like I mentioned, not even until near 2000, there are more undocumented wells on file with state agencies than there are wells, than the wells that are on file. So for instance, in New York, they only have about 125,000 or 150,000 well logs on file. That's because they didn't start requiring those be filed until 2000. Their Department of Health did a study looking at all the tax codes, and they found where people had responded for their parcel, whether or not they were on a private well or not. And so they know there's at least 700,000 more wells in New York than they have records for. And so at least they have an idea of where they're at, which is great. But we have other states like Mississippi where if it's 5 inches, if it's less than a 5-inch well, it doesn't have to be reported. So a lot of those wells go unreported. And just like, whenever you buy a property, someone moves out to the country, there's always that old well that was there, and then you put in a new well, or someone else had already put in a new well. They leave that old well there. Maybe originally it was so they could have a garden, and then it just falls away and everybody forgets about it. They're a source of contamination, and they're an extreme safety hazard. That's a big open hole. You hear all the time about people falling in those. And it's also a liability for you if you're a well owner and a homeowner. If you don't abandon it properly, fill it in, someone falls in, whether they're supposed to be on your property or not, they can get hurt or killed, or somebody may pour something down there, or somehow it may contaminate the aquifer you're using for your good well, so to speak. Here's some examples. Again, these two pictures come from the Washington State Department of Ecology. This is from their blog. And these are two old wells. One had a horse in it and one had a guy in it. The guy fell 45 feet and came out fine. Very lucky. But these newspaper clippings, Illinois used to have a groundwater education coordinator many years ago, and he provided all these to me when he left. These are all in Illinois. They were all around the same time except the third one. That was Jessica McClure in Texas. I know those of you that are old enough remember back in, I think, 95 or 97, where she'd fallen in a well. She was 18 months old, and it was covered live on CNN for like 18 hours while they dug her out. But this really happens. People fall into these things all the time, and there's no reason for it. They should be sealed. So as far as basic well care, for best management practices, BMPs, you should use a licensed well driller, a pump installer, or contractor whenever you're constructing, servicing, or repairing your well. There are folks out there who have some of those skills, We also have folks who use sand points, for instance, but we don't consider those, especially sand points, as being safe. They're not very deep, and so a lot of surface contamination. They're also in areas where it's usually sandier soils with a shallow water table, so there's a lot more chance of surface contamination getting into the water table. And so it's important that the well is properly sealed. If you look at this red or this blue well cap on the right, there's 5 bolts there, and in between the two, the bolts are holding a rubber gasket in place between the cap and the fitting that goes around the well casing. I can't tell you how many, but most of the wells I've ever opened have the original rubber gasket that is maybe half there, if there at all, and it's brittle and it's lost its ability to be watertight and sealed. People just don't replace these. No one thinks about it, but it's one reason why now if that well were overtopped by water, this looks like a pretty new well, but an older well where that rubber gasket isn't functioning anymore would likely end up having contamination and bacteria problems. So most states, not every state, but most states have rules on how to, what kind of well you can drill, what kind of casing you can use, setbacks for how far you have to be from certain things and all that stuff. And, you know, it's worth, if you're going to drill a new well, it's worth looking at this, or making sure that you understand the driller you're using is following code and is licensed in your state and all those things. And so it's just, the more you know, the better. And I realize reading Minnesota Rules Chapter 4725 doesn't sound very exciting, but you can thumb through that and find the more pertinent points about well construction. So then at least you can ask the driller right questions, or maybe you have a preference on pipe type, all those sorts of things. But it's regulated so that people just don't go out and put in their own wells, use unapproved casing. You know, I just heard at the same conference in North Carolina, I heard a talk from Virginia Tech about they started looking at the casing that's used for drop pipe for a well pump, and found that some of the pipe was from the States and some of it was from other countries. I think like 4 other countries, a number of wells they pulled that had were having problems with lead leaching. And it's because some of the things that are manufactured overseas may not have been done to the standards they should have been. So it's really important to understand, you know, make sure and ask those questions, I guess. As far as the well site, I mentioned before, you need to make sure there's nothing around the well. It should be clear from anything. This is a PVC well with a, you know, just a standard well cap. It'll have a vent on it. It should have a screen. Make sure the screen's in place so that bugs and other things can't get in there. We've opened these up and seen beehives, you know, inside them. So you don't want to do that. And it should be elevated. And again, that's to protect it from any kind of flooding that might occur. And this doesn't show it, but the well really should have soil mounded around it so that water's flowing away from it. That it says annulus sealed and ground sloped. For those of you who, the annulus, so when you drill a well, let's say you're going to say that's a 5-inch PVC casing. The well you drilled, the hole you drilled might have been 6 7/8 or 8 3/8 or something like that. So the hole's bigger than the casing, so you can get it in, and then you fill the area around that casing with grout, which is usually a clay or cement that isn't permeable. And so if the well's properly constructed and the grout's in place that's supposed to be there, then things can't flow down along the well column on the outside to cause, you know, surface contamination because that seal's in place. And you know, inspect your area for potential sources. We see, especially some of the older wells, I've went up to folks' houses and to help them with their well, and their well's out in the middle of a feedlot. And I don't mean a pasture that's got grass growing. I mean a feedlot that's 6 inches of mud with, you know, 50 cattle in it in a small area. And they're rubbing on the side of it, and you know, it's a shallow well. Those sorts of things, you know, people just take it for granted. And you know, honestly, as did my dad and grandfather, that it was okay to have it that way. This is an example from Minnesota Department of Health, and I do use them a lot, and that's partly because they have a lot of materials available and they're very good at their jobs. As far as on the well side, they have a really big program, bigger than most states, and they do a lot of work to try to ensure that their well owners are informed and aware. So this is their state code, and it basically has setback requirements for all of these things. And really the point here aren't the numbers, the 50 feet or the 35 feet. It's about all the things that are considered an influence to well water quality and why you need to have some distance. You know, and some of these, if it's sensitive soils, like really sandy soils, there may be rules that say it has to be further away, like especially for a septic or an underground storage tank. And so this is really meant to show you the width and the breadth, so to speak, of all the things that might impact your well and why you need to know, what's around it. And here's the bottom half of that diagram. And so, yeah, it's just, again, this is for the state of Minnesota. Illinois' rules are a little different. Every other state's rules are a little different. And so you need to look those up and be sure. But especially for installation of wells and septic, in most states, not every one, someone has to sign off as an engineer or a licensed in their field that the well and the septic at least are a certain distance from each other and from neighboring wells and septics. And so there's some assurance that's been built in through regulation, just because we see all the time old systems where the well is 10 feet from the junction box or from the septic tank, and that's just not a safe way to do things. Okay, septic systems. Now, so this is a private well program, but obviously septic systems are an important part of important source, if you will, of potential contamination. And so we did a septic webinar, which goes into a lot more detail than I am today on septic systems and where you can get information. I will provide some of that today. But the idea here is you need to understand your septic tank. It's, they have to be pumped because they get solids buildup. You can see in this tank on the diagram on the left side, there's solids at the bottom and then there's some stuff floating on top. Well, all that stuff comes from your house, from your faucet, your shower, your toilet, everywhere, and goes in here, and there's bacteria that break that down. This is a two compartment system so that most of the solids stay on the first half, and that's so that they can be pumped out when it gets full or mostly full. And then the treated water, so to speak, or the water that's had bacteria working on it, then flows out into a septic field, or soil absorption field it's called here, where then it goes out into this gravel layer that's been installed and percolates into the ground where soil microbes and things can break it down further. This is a natural system. It's a treatment plant, if you will, and it works great without any additives, anything else done to it, as long as you do the right things. And so we'll go through some of those best practices. So on your to-do list, if you're a septic system owner, is to maintain the area around your tank and drain field. So there's an inspection port and there's also a manhole. A septic professional should be able to go to the inspection port and determine how much solids are in your tank. And what I guess I didn't mention is the last thing on here: pump your tank on a regular schedule. You'd be surprised how many people have attended our septic webinar and asked, how do I find my septic tank? They're not even sure where it's at. And, that's a bad thing because it needs to be maintained as well. If that fills up or it clogs up the septic field, then eventually stuff is going to start coming out of the top of your septic tank. You'll notice really green grass and then wet ground, or worst case, it flows back into your home and backs up. And that happens a lot, actually. So as far as maintaining the area around your tank and drain field, it should just be grass, no trees. There's a lot of guys who clean out tile lines and septic lines and stuff like that make a living off of having trees near a septic line. They find a way in, those roots find a way in it. And and you also don't want to compact the soil. So that's why it says no concrete or asphalt. You shouldn't drive over it, all those sorts of things. And reduce the flow in your septic system as much as you can. So no sump pumps, whirlpools, and actually, there's some arguments about the water quality issues related to softener backwash, but it's just not a great idea if you're putting very much water through there to add additional. The bacteria in our stomachs are the bacteria that are in our septic tanks and actually break down all the material. So to give them time to work and to actually break things down, you should only be using your normal use. And that's how they're sized, and that's how you determine how often to pump them, is based on normal use, based on, some states like Massachusetts use number of bedrooms as a guide for how big your septic system needs to be. So, and only put wastewater in. You shouldn't use a garbage disposal if you have a septic system. Those solids can't be broken down because they haven't been even, they're just full pieces, if you will. And so they end up becoming solids in the bottom of the tank. And I know some folks recommend that if you have a garbage disposal and you're using it, that you should pump your tank at least twice as often as you would regularly. And also common sense things, no paint, pills, things like amoxicillin kill bacteria. So why you'd put that flush it down your toilet where it's going to go into your septic system and kill the bacteria that are, working for you, doesn't make sense. So, and again, you get a feel for your tank after you've used it a while and you know how often it needs to be pumped. If you've never had it pumped, I recommend you should get it pumped and then have someone come back and inspect it in a year or two to see how many solids, how high the solids level is in there. And then you'll have a good measure for how often you may need to pump it. Because a lot of folks maybe buy a house out in a rural area with a septic system and there's no information about their septic tank. You have no idea how big it is. There's no record of it being installed. And so you kind of have to just play it safe. I do want to mention the EPA Septic Smart program, and I'll show a few slides here. This has really grown over the last several years, and they've actually started in September a Septic Smart Week, and it's just an opportunity for professionals in our business to highlight that and make people aware of some of the materials that are available and why you need to know about your septic system and all that stuff. So it's just epa.gov/septic, and you can go there on your own. They have a ton of free materials. If you click on learn about septic systems, then you get an overview. There's all these things you can read. They've created a lot of helpful brochures and things about what you need to do, how to learn about your septic system, what different types there are. These days it's because we have so many vulnerable areas, like we're in an area with a lake where it's bedrock at the surface. And so that's very susceptible to movement of material through the cracks and fissures. And so maybe they have to have an aerobic system or one that really is just like a community treatment system, so that what's being discharged is water that's safe right from the septic unit. So it goes into all those things, what you need to do. And then there's like outreach toolkits for those of us, like we'll promote all this stuff during Septic Smart Week as well. It's a good program. Even diagrams explain how this all works, septic systems and drinking water, what happens. Here's the top part of that diagram. And so what, I'm going to go to the bottom here. It just explains what can happen, even if your septic tank and your drain field on the other side. Again, number 6 there, the groundwater flow direction. If it turns out your well's fairly shallow and that material from the drain field still has bacteria in it, and it gets into the aquifer after a while, it could affect your well. So it's always good, especially if you just bought some property and you're going to put in a well and a septic, put those things as far away as possible. Don't necessarily just make sure it meets the state's guidelines, the minimum. There's also technical information. Again, I talked about aerobic systems for advanced on-site technology products, and you click on this and you can go to different states and see what's approved. Some people choose to even do this just because what's being output is already safe for the environment for sure. And there's technology issues there because you have to know how to run it. There's even places where it requires a licensed operator to run these individual systems. So, and this is, again, just a link to that. So they've done a bunch of webcasts or webinars like we're doing here over the last few years, and all of those are also available. And so you can look at tools, things that you might be interested in. And I know there's a button down here on funding. We did a webinar just on funding for water and wastewater for wells and septic back in February, and you can find that on our website as well. So about testing, we recommend you test your well annually, and anytime the well's been opened or there's any kind of change, taste, odor, smell, or color, sorry. And so it's important to test your well, and then you know for sure. It's estimated between 65 and 70% of private wells have never been tested. And that's just, especially if you have children or, you're in an area where it's prone to have things like arsenic or uranium or some other natural contaminants, it just makes sense to do those things. So what do you test for? Well, it really is different depending on the type of well you have and how deep it is, and what formation the water is coming from, and if there's known contaminants in the area. So honestly, I'm going to give you a list of what we recommend, but the other part of that is go talk to your county or state health department for advice. If you call them, they want to help you, or local. I guess, like in Massachusetts, they're not county health departments, they're local jurisdictions. But you call and ask them and say, hey, do we have any issues in our state or in this area that I need to be concerned with for contaminants? And they'll know. And so then you should add that to your list for sure. And so other people you can talk to, state well record folks, your neighbors, drillers, co-op extension. If they are working with well owners, they will know, just like, in Penn State Extension, the folks there pretty much have a handle on what you should test for all over the state. They've been doing well owner outreach and education for 25, 30 years at least. And so they're folks you can rely on. And so one thing is you sample for coliform and nitrate annually. They indicate a pathway into your well. What that means is that coliform itself may not be harmful, and nitrate, what's known about nitrate is the standard is 10, but that's the real concern is for pregnant women and children under, I think, six months or a year, because their bodies aren't developed enough that they can break down the nitrate the correct way. It turns to nitrite that binds with the hemoglobin in their blood, and that's called blue baby syndrome. There's a big long name for it that I don't remember. But for adults, now there's some research that may indicate nitrate at high levels can be a problem, but there's nothing formally that I know of. And if anyone online wants to correct me, that's fine. But they're easy to test for and they're cheap to test for. And if you find either one of them at levels that are above background or for coliform at all, it indicates that there's a pathway into your well. And that's why you do that. So that, I'll use the example of me growing up. We had a riding mower. Now I couldn't hit our well with our riding mower, but if our well were in our front yard and looked like the one we just saw a minute ago with a white PVC, as a high schooler, how often do you think I might bump into that with a mower if I'm trying to mow around it? It's pretty easy to crack that, or crack it maybe down at a joint that's 3 foot below land surface, so you won't even know it, but there's a pathway into the well. And so testing, and again, it's fairly inexpensive, is a way for you to be sure that nothing's changed about your well and all of a sudden you have a bacteria or nitrate issue that you didn't have before. I wanted to show a couple examples because some states have materials available on their websites. So this is the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and they've got this site set up. So they've studied uranium and arsenic issues in their area. There's a lot of them. And so they've developed this map and this interactive tool. You can put your address in, and it'll tell you whether or not you're at risk of one or both of those constituents, and then how to find a lab to test for them if you are. And so, that's pretty helpful if you're a Massachusetts well owner, and it gives you an idea of, at least for those things, whether or not you need to test for them, along with whatever else you might test in a normal sample. So, and this is Rhode Island. And I show this map because you never know what you're going to find. And so the little dots are all where there used to be orchards, and there's known soil contamination from arsenic, which used to be used as the pesticide, arsenic-based pesticides. And so now they see all these soils, and it leaches eventually into groundwater very high in arsenic. And so if you're near one of those, it's a way, at least it gives you something to call the state Department of Health and ask, here's where I live, should I be concerned about this? But the big splotch in the middle of the screen is where there's high beryllium. And, I use this all the time because it's a great example. If I ask 10 health experts or 10 people who work under the Safe Drinking Water Act like I do about beryllium, 6 years ago, I would have said, beryllium, I don't think that's even a regulated contaminant. It is. It has health effects, but you never see it except certainly in Rhode Island. There's a lot of it. And so that's why you need to go ask and follow up, because we wouldn't recommend testing for beryllium for the whole country. But if you're in the central part of Rhode Island, we definitely believe you should, just in case it's high. So you've got to be inquisitive and diligent and all those things as you do this. And as we move forward with technology, the Wisconsin DNR, which regulates the private wells in Wisconsin, has worked with the Center for Watershed Science and Education at Wisconsin Stevens Point to develop this interactive map. So you can go in and you can look at constituents. So I went in here, this is a screenshot, and these are all the private well samples that they have data for. So some of the counties look blank and you can see the background on those instead of being green or another color. And that's because there's no data for those counties. But I clicked on display arsenic by county, and it gives me a graph of the samples they have and what the arsenic levels have been in the samples they've done. Now there's, it looks like near Green Bay, there's several counties there where arsenic's fairly high, over 21. And then there's, one county where it's never been detected. All the samples are below the detection limit. But it looks like in a lot of those areas, most of the state has it up to 5 micrograms per liter, which, the EPA health standard is 10. So it's just a tool that's available. You have to look for these things to find them. And, it's very worthwhile. You can search for other constituents and things like that too. So what we recommend, again, is sampling for coliform and nitrate annually. They indicate a pathway into your well, and I can't stress that enough. We see so many wells that aren't protected at the surface, and it's clear from that they do have those issues. And then we recommend every 3 to 5 years you should sample for this suite of constituents, just to have an idea of your water chemistry, how hard your water is, what the pH is. pH and alkalinity together can give you an idea if your water's corrosive or aggressive to galvanized pipe or lead or copper. Manganese, for instance, we just had an issue this week where a private well tested high in manganese. It doesn't have a health limit under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but now there's growing evidence that suggests maybe it should be. So the EPA is looking at that, but it'll be a number of years before a determination is made whether it needs to be. But there's evidence from some research, and some of the state health departments and Health Canada have both issued guidance on health advice on how high manganese should be for people to drink it. So it's just, you have to be informed and or develop a relationship with your local health professional, your EHP that's at your county or local health department. They have a lot of information, and they're there to help you. So, and again, always ask for advice. You're never going to know if you have a potential beryllium issue unless you go ask. So, okay. So what about getting it analyzed? Well, every state accredits labs so that community and public water supplies have a place they can go for analysis. So I would try to use one of those on the list. You can go to a state website, or you can go to actually the EPA's website, and there's a list of all the states and the labs that are approved to do samples in their state. Now, a caveat on that is there are labs like our lab and other university labs like at Virginia Tech and at Texas A&M that follow all the EPA guidelines, but they're no longer accredited just because of the process and the expense of doing so. So when I do work, I use our lab, Dan's lab actually, for all of our analysis, and we follow all the EPA protocols, but it's technically not an accredited lab sample, so it might not be defendable in court would be the only issue there. The results we get are excellent, and we know that they're doing things the right way. They do duplicates and blanks and all those things. And I just bring that up because there are labs who aren't accredited, or even there are labs that are accredited, but for a private well owner, they may use a different method and that's not accredited. And so you need to ask those questions when you talk to the lab. Are you using, the EPA accredited method for arsenic analysis, for instance? And other things to know, some states do have programs for private well sampling. Iowa has a grants to counties program. Their state legislature gives funds to their counties for either well abandonment or for private well testing. New Mexico has a program where if you'll register your septic system, they will do a water analysis on your well as a way to incentivize basically getting more information about the septic systems in their state. So, and CDC has a program. It's called the Safe Watch program, and you can Google that, but they fund 19 states and 4 counties, I believe, to work on different types of programs in different states, but some of those involve sampling. I know it does in Tennessee, and the county programs do. Like there's one in Madison County, New York, and all those programs provide some funding for sampling. So again, it's a thing where you need to kind of look for that and do some searches online. And also, again, I'll plug one more time, we did a webinar in February on funding, and it was really mostly about how to fund getting a well built, and it's mostly for low-income folks, but where those programs are anyway. But it also does have information about other programs like soil and water conservation districts, for instance, have a program in some states where they'll cost share abandoning a well. And so instead of costing $1,000, it might only cost $500, that sort of thing. So as far as labs, getting back on track, a good lab can give you detailed instructions. They can answer your questions. They'll tell you how to store it and preserve it, how quick you need to get it back to the lab, and they should be able to give you everything you need. And if they can't provide that, then I would find another lab and ask questions until you're satisfied and sure. Because some labs are better than others, just like some drillers are better than others, just like some hydrologists are better than others at meeting the needs of their customers. And so some labs are really good at providing all that information and have someone on staff, and some don't. And so it's, it's like even buying a home with a well, it's buyer beware. And so you need to do your due diligence before you pick a lab to make sure you're going to get credible results and that you're comfortable with what they've told you and all that stuff. So, but the lab itself should be able to provide bottles and everything you need and explain all that to you. As far as interpreting results, so the most important thing here is that we recommend you take them to your local health department or your state health department to get a qualified answer from an environmental health professional. Sometimes those lab reports are confusing. Sometimes the units are different than what, for instance, the MCL for arsenic is 10 micrograms per liter. It may be reported as 0.01 milligrams per liter. Well, you see 0.01 and you think, oh, well, mine's really low. Well, that's 10. So you need to understand units and all those things. And so it's best to take it to someone who is used to working with all those numbers. I know just as an example for our private well class, we've had over 7,000 people take our class, and about 5,000 of those or more have done the pre-test and the post-test. And one of the questions on there asks you to basically convert from milligrams per liter to ppb, parts per billion, and only 27% of people get the question right. So it's meant to highlight the fact that, working with all those numbers and doing conversions actually isn't that simple. All of us make mistakes with math, certainly I do. And so that's why you need to take it to somebody who is used to doing that. All that said, well, one, if you find something in your well, especially if it's really high, I would resample to confirm. If it's atypical, especially like if you go to the local health department, they're like, wow, we've never seen this value this high. It could have been a mistake. Labs have to dilute samples and certain things that are going on in a lab procedure, and something could have just been done wrong. And so it's always good to do that before you get too alarmed. And then if you've done a coliform test and it's positive, then you should go do an E. coli test because that's what is harmful. And you should boil your water used for drinking and cooking until you can chlorinate your well, and you get that. And then after that, you test again and make sure it's gone. So all that said, there are some websites and documents online that give you a sense of what results you do have, and I'm going to highlight one of those because it's actually a pretty cool site. So the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide for the residents in New Hampshire, but it actually works for anyone. And what it is, it's a tool you can use to plug in your sample results, and it has all the MCLs embedded in it, so it'll say, hey, this is over an MCL or this is not. And so, for instance, you click on the bottom down here, it says enter your well test results. And when you go into this, you can tell it which New Hampshire town or city you're in if you look at the upper right, or you can just say anonymous. They're trying to get information out there. They don't want to track your results unless you're willing to, but it helps them understand like where arsenic might be high, all those sorts of things if you're in New Hampshire. So I put in 15 for a unit, and then you click on units and you have a drop down, which is really handy. So you can put it in the units that's on the lab report, and that's much less difficult to screw up the math if you can put it in the units that you have. So I could either put in 15 micrograms per liter, or I could have put in 0.015 milligrams per liter, which milligrams per liter is the same as parts per million. Micrograms per liter is the same as parts per billion. I only filled out this one piece, but if you have a sample result, and we had New Hampshire come and talk about this at our private well conference we held in 2017, and since then at least 9 states have looked at getting this code and developing it for their own state pages to help the residents in their states. So it is, it is something that's been vetted through a state agency. It's not, it's all free, and it's something that's just meant to be useful. And so when you plug in those results, it'll tell you, I got a red X for arsenic being 15 micrograms per liter, which is 0.015 milligrams per liter, and the standard is 0.01 milligrams per liter. Now, what I'll say about that, I probably should have said earlier, is the health standards, like 10 micrograms per liter as an MCL from the EPA, only applies to public water supplies. As a private well owner, if you want to drink water with arsenic at 15, you're more than welcome to. And you cannot imagine how many people I've ran into in Illinois that are we have one aquifer that has some higher arsenic, where they're like, my grandpa drank this and lived to be 80 something, we've drank this our whole life, and it's arsenic at 50 or 100 parts per billion. That's up to an individual. That's an individual decision. I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you have kids, or if you have anyone else who's going to drink the water. They may be more susceptible. Maybe it doesn't hurt you, but all that's a complicated issue. And so this at least tells you, based on the standard for public water supplies, where you might sit. And then the other advantage to this system is it also recommends types of treatment. And so point of use, that's either arsenic absorptive media filter system or reverse osmosis. And what we know from some of the research that's been done is that, especially for RO, arsenic exists in 2 forms, +3 and +5, and it needs to be oxidized to the +5 version in order for RO to be as effective as it can be. And so, it may, there's things you can do there, treatment professionals can help you with, as far as putting, some kind of oxidizing, chlorinator or something in front of it to do that. So, but this is a lot of good information for you then to take to someone and have them explain to you what you might need to do. So, and that's the point here. And again, this is from the state of New Hampshire. We think it's a great tool, but you shouldn't just rely on things from the web. You should then take this to your health department because this is a health issue, and it's a health risk issue. And so you should only take advice from health professionals, which we are not. Okay, so this is further down the page. It kind of tells you about NSF and ANSI standards. And so they're a third-party certifier. The National Sanitation Foundation is a third-party certifier. There's a couple others. UL, Underwriters Laboratory, and Water Quality Association also have where they actually test these devices and make sure that they do what they say they're going to do. And so what we would recommend, and it's in our class lessons under lesson 10, don't buy a treatment device that doesn't have an NSF ANSI standard for that constituent that you're trying to remove. Because you'll see online 50 different devices that remove arsenic. Some of them are certified, some aren't, and the ones that aren't are about half the price. But there's been no testing done to guarantee they actually work like they're supposed to. And I guess the other side of that is, even if it's supposed to and it's got an ANSI, an NSF ANSI or a NSF or UL or WQA logo on it, meaning it has been tested, I would still test the water after the treatment's installed to make sure your treatment device is working the way it's supposed to. Okay. So again, these tools are only a guide for typical water. So you should always take your results to the health department to get a qualified answer. And I know, so there are a couple places, I've talked to 2 health professionals in Massachusetts where they have some authority to affect what happens to your well if it's contaminated. But everywhere else in the country, like in Illinois, your health department may recommend that you don't drink the water, but it's up to you. No one can tell you you can't. And so you should use the health department as a resource and an asset, not assume that they're going to do something that may say you can't drink your water, because they can't do that. And if you're concerned, you should just ask them that question. Call your local health department. If there's something bad in my well, can you tell them? Can you condemn my well? And 99.6% of those folks are going to say no. So anyway. Basic well care as far as treatment. So on our website, or in our class, we also talk about all the different types of treatment. This just shows an RO unit and how it works, and also a water softener. But the message here is, especially there's a lot of hard water for groundwater, so a lot of people have softeners. And now more people are putting like RO under their sinks and things like that, just as a precaution, even though they haven't tested, which we would recommend not using any treatment unless you've tested and you need to. One, all these things need to be maintained. And the message here is, if you don't maintain and replace on the right schedule and you're not strict about following it, those things can become a source of contamination. A filter that's completely full and blocked can start harboring bacteria, for instance. So we actually had one of the regional guys one of the regional private well people for Minnesota Department of Health actually asked us not to talk about treatment in our class. In his experience, he's seen more people who don't take care of their treatment equipment, and it's become a source of contamination rather than making their water quality better. And so, I don't know how to stress it enough. It's not adding treatment and you're done. There's a cost, and there's also a responsibility. And so if you're going to have treatment, or you bought a home that has treatment installed, you should know how it works, and you should know how to change it, change the media, change the filter, backwash the softener, all those things. So that's what I have today. Now the rest of the today we're going to spend talking about the questions we received from all of you. We won't be able to answer them all. There were a lot of questions. And so what we're going to go through some of those, and Dan's going to help me. And while we're talking, I don't know, I haven't looked to see if anybody's asked any questions yet. It looks like we have 3 so far. So yeah, feel free to put a question in the question box, and Katie's keeping track of those. We're sharing a Google Doc, which I'll just pull over to the screen whenever we get down to the end. So if you ask a question, stick around and we'll go through those. So yeah, I'm going to move forward. Okay, so where to sample why? I left this in. I should have put this up with the rest of it. or maybe I didn't cover it, but it's best to collect a sample from the faucet in the house. Oh, this was the question. When is it best to collect a water sample from a faucet in the house, and when is it best to sample at or near the well? Well, so which Dan will tell you, our lab usually asks for both. And part of that's because we collect the information from like an outside spigot where it's not been through any treatment, and we ask well owners to let it run so that the water that we're getting samples for is actually the groundwater coming from the well. And that gives us information on the natural groundwater quality. But it's also important to understand that that's not going to have the same water quality as the water at your kitchen tap, both because of possible treatment, softener, filter, RO, whatever, but also because of the piping. If it's lead or has copper or whatever, it could change depending on the type of water chemistry you have. So again, the outside tap is representative of well water. The kitchen tap is representative of your drinking water, and they can be significantly different. And I'm going to show you an example of that because that's the best way to do this. And it is better to have both. Whether and it will cost you more if you're going through a lab that you're paying for the sample, but it's important to understand if the existing treatment is being beneficial. You should see a difference, which you will in this example, like hardness should really drop if you have a softener. Some of those sorts of things that really give, especially a water quality professional, information to better assess your situation. So this is a well near Champaign, and in 2015 they sampled, and this is from the outside tap, outside spigot. So it's before any kind of treatment, and you can see if you look over on the right, part way down, where it says turbidity, color, pH, and odor. pH is 8.2, the color is 48.1, which Dan can explain those units, and the turbidity, which is kind of a measure of how much, well, what is it, Dan? It's kind of, yeah, how turbid the
suspended material, how turbid it is.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and the other things to notice here are hardness down at the bottom right is 351, and the sodium is 25.9. Okay. So then in the next sample, it's after a softener and a filter. So you can see what happened to these parameters up on the top, the iron, potassium, calcium, they all went way down, right? Because the softener is doing its job, but the sodium went up to 198. And so an unintended consequence of having a softener may be that your sodium in your drinking water is much higher than it was in your natural water. And if you're someone who's on a low sodium diet, it probably, I don't know if it's enough to make a difference, but it's something I would ask a health professional. The other thing to notice is the hardness went down to 0.68 down the bottom right, and the turbidity and color were dramatically improved. And that's partly because, well, it's mostly because of the filter, I imagine. So just running it through a filter and softener have, created a different kind of water quality for this person. And then they also have an RO unit. So they took a sample at their kitchen tap after the RO, and those less than arrows mean it's below the detection limit for our lab. But you can see it took out almost all the sodium as well. But the other thing it did is it lowered the pH to 6.23, neutral 7. So now we have very slightly acidic water, which, whether that's corrosive or not is another thing. Some other factors I think go into that. But, it's most of our groundwater in Illinois is between, according to Dan, is 7.5 or 8 pH, which, is generally less corrosive and less aggressive. But it just shows you how much treatment can affect your water quality sample. Most of these are below detection limit, which means it's taking a lot of things out of the water. So home test kits. Dan, this is really for you. The question was, is there a system to test water by myself without sending it to a lab? And so this is all yours.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we get similar questions to this all the time because sometimes it's still a good idea to use a lab, but sometimes people, maybe they're in a hurry or want to save some money. And there are lots of different test kits out there. One important thing that if you're going to use a test kit, make sure you understand the units. You'll see some of the obvious ones are milligrams per liter and micrograms per liter, but also, like Steve mentioned earlier, how to convert those to parts per million or parts per billion. And I think basically Steve covered that pretty nicely earlier. And then it seems like sometimes people have asked us to look into the kits, and there's sometimes the wording stands out as a little bit funny. Like they might say it'll take out pesticides or something, but it doesn't really say which pesticides, and so it can be suspicious. It might not take. There's lots of pesticides out there, and they're different structures and different functionalities. And it might take a lot of them out, but it's you just got to watch for that, and maybe think about it when you're buying a filter. And if they say EPA, it may not mean that it's certified by the EPA to take out a certain contaminant. So just be careful with some of the wording. Sometimes it seems like it's perhaps more advertising, but it's not dishonest. I don't think. It's just be sure you look at it carefully.
Well, some of them just don't do what they're supposed to. So if they're supposed to provide you a result, yeah, especially the EPA thing, you see that.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where we saw that, but it was, yeah. And the other important thing is to follow the instructions carefully. And then it's a good idea to verify your results. Sometimes the kits are nice and they're usually either instant or within a few minutes, but sometimes they can show false positives, especially when you're trying to interpret two very close colors, like maybe near what the limit of the test, the lower limit of the test can test for. You can get, some things are okay. Our general idea is to go to a lab. That's the best way to get an analysis. And so we don't generally recommend the at-home test kits, but there are things, if you're going to buy them, there are, I can mention some places where you can get them, especially for things like pH and hardness. If you're testing for chlorine, like if you're disinfecting your well and you want to test for chlorine, you can get some common test strips at most pool stores or aquarium shops. The aquarium places will have more than you'll find in pool stores. They'll have things like nitrates and other nutrients that will be related to fish. I think you can get some pH meters and total dissolved solids meters or conductivity meters pretty cheaply on various stores. I mean, I don't want to single out Amazon, but that's a place you can find stuff like that, or home garden stores. You can find some things, but I'd be careful about trusting them too much.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next one's for you too. So we also had several questions about how do you determine the right filter? For our needs?
Yeah, that is a big question, and I just want to make sure I say this up front. I like to refer people to the dealers because they'll have experience in your area. But you can look for things. The best thing to do is be sample first, and like some things will be obvious. If you see a clear issue like staining or sediment, then certainly sediment filters are fairly cheap. Easy to change. In my opinion, it's a pretty good idea for anybody to have a sediment filter right after their pressure tank. But let's say you're talking about a softener. A lot of people around here have softeners, but you may not need a softener. They can be expensive. You may or may not need a reverse osmosis filter. Some people will have filters, like Steve said this before. They may have a filter just because, hey, it sounds like a good idea. But we get questions all the time about, oh, hey, my filter was working and now it's not working, and it developed a smell, and so on and so on. And it's the same thing Steve mentioned earlier. Lots of different people will say they're breeding grounds for bacteria if you don't maintain them properly. So get your water tested. A lot of people will be concerned with aesthetic things like hardness and iron. Most softeners will work well for those. Reverse osmosis works well for lots of things too, but there's several things that you have to be careful with that. They can follow the membrane with hardness or biological growth, so you want to have a good water going into the RO unit. There's probably some other things I could cover, but yeah, that's the basics.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So we also had more than usual. We had people who said, "Hey, I'm new to being a well owner. I want to understand how to take care of my well, And so, so I just wanted to go ahead and throw this up there. If you're new and you really want to understand and take care of your well, you really should take our class. So, I mean, this webinar is a great start, but really you should sign up for our class. It's much more detailed and it walks you through things. You give us your email address, or you sign up with your email address, and it sends you a lesson once a week for 10 weeks. It's a PDF, so it's self-paced. You're on your own to read it, but it's completely free. And you know, that's what I said at the bottom here. You have to read it. That's the only catch. You'd be surprised at how many folks have commented in our evaluation at the end of the class that they wished it was more on video and they didn't have to read so much. So that's the world we live in today, I guess. But if you go to privatewellclass.org, this is the page that comes up for privatewellclass.org. You can click on the thing in the middle that says take our free class, or click on learn by email down the bottom left, and that takes you to this page where basically it just asks for your email address, your first name, and where do you live is which state do you live in. And that's actually really for us to be able to say to the folks that fund us, we're helping people in all 50 states and actually 10 or 11 countries. And you just click on, if you're a well owner, you want to click on the first box underneath there that says class instruction emails. And the outreach partnership is really for folks who are working with well owners, so drillers, labs, EHPs, realtors. And we send out a monthly newsletter that's really for our partners, if you will, that provides them with new resources and information about things that we're doing that are materials we can provide to them that they can then provide to well owners, stuff like that. And so it's pretty simple. And again, it comes once a week. It's if you sign up at 3 p.m. today for the class, you'll get an email with the pretest and lesson 1, and then every 3 p.m. on a Thursday, you're going to get the next lesson for the next 10 weeks. It'll come in your email from us, and then it'll ask you to do a post-test and an evaluation. And the reason NEHA is even a partner on our grant today is because of the first 500 or 700 people that took the class. Almost 25% were sanitarians or environmental health professionals, and all of them in the evaluation said, 1, why wasn't this available when I started my job? And 2, how can I get CEUs for this? So we started investigating that and found that NEHA is an accreditor in a lot of the country. And so we went to them and asked if they'd be interested in partnering with us to put our class on their website. So now environmental health professionals that have NEHA credentials, or if your state accepts NEHA CEUs, can go on NEHA's website and get 1 CEU for each of the 10 lessons. So it's pretty cool. All right. How to choose a drilling contractor. How do I choose a well company for care, maintenance, replacement, etc.? So you're going to see a theme here, but we cover this in more detail in our lesson 7, which is about local help and things like that. But here's kind of the Cliff Notes version. A good driller or contractor should stand out. They're going to be knowledgeable. When you talk to them, they're going to, they're going to have their ducks in a row. There's a lot of things. It's just like you can tell someone who comes in who's, they should just stand out. Be sure they're licensed for your area, your jurisdiction. And, a bonus or a plus would be if they're certified through the National Groundwater Association as a master well driller. That's kind of an additional program. I mean, they have to pass a test to become licensed in their state as a licensed well driller, and they have to take continuing education credit in some states, not all. But to go through the Master Well Driller program just means that they've taken it upon themselves to learn a little more and become a little better and more professional at their job. And it's certainly not required, and you may have a really great driller in your area that is not a Master Well Driller, and so I don't want to single them out, but you should ask. So the other, and also pick someone who can do it all. And this is my personal opinion. Because you have guys who install wells, you have guys who put in pumps, who come in and put in the equipment in your basement or wherever. It's just easier to work with one company and deal with things, especially if you have a problem. Where does one person's responsibility start and another person's end? Just as a best practice, I would recommend, and I'm saying that just for myself, that you find someone who does all of that work. Then you know who you're dealing with, and you can develop a relationship with them. So yeah, ask lots of questions to better understand both them and their know-how. And especially if you've gone through our class and you have some questions, you should ask them. They're drilling professionals, especially anything about a well or the geology around your area. They should be able to tell you answers to that. They should be able to explain things much better than we could. And so you should ask them, and that way you get to know them better. You feel more comfortable with what the amount of money you're putting out, because a well is an expensive proposition, all those sorts of things. And get a contract, as well as make sure they have liability insurance. Those are just common things. Very rarely in today could a driller be drilling without liability insurance. And so that's probably not as big of an issue. But when I say get a contract, you need to have a contract with them for a couple things. And one of the things I'll mention is many well owners we talk to don't have their well log. And they'll call a driller or a drilling company where maybe their well was drilled 20 years ago. There's a lot of competition among drillers, especially in some areas. And so they protect that information because it's a protected business practice to know what the geology is, how deep you're going to have to drill, all those things. But you're the well owner, you have a right to that information. So make sure that's in the contract that they give you the completed well log with the geology and all the information about the pump, the type of casing, all the materials, the location, and everything that's submitted to the state or their local jurisdiction that requires that. That way you have a record of it. It's no different than getting something done to your car. You should keep track of every time you've had the oil changed, if when you replace the tires, all those things, so you can, where you stand with your well and all that stuff. So I would also contact your state for recommendations. Most states probably won't give you one. They don't want to single out drillers, but a few may. And you can also ask them if they've had any complaints against any drillers. And that's a really good thing to know, because it should be public information if they've done something wrong. And this is all about protecting you. And I've mentioned the term buyer beware a couple times, but especially if you're buying a home with a well, it is buyer beware. You need to get the well tested first. You need to make sure that you're comfortable with the water quality and what's there. I can give you a bunch of examples where people have bought two in Illinois where they were buying a house. One, they asked us first. We told them to get their well tested. It had 79 parts per billion of arsenic. They ended up not using their well. It turned out city water was available across the street, and they ran a line into the road. Another case, a woman called me. She'd had her well. She bought the house 4 years ago, has 4 kids, and their arsenic level was over 200 parts per billion. But she didn't test it, and at the time, they only had to test for coliform and nitrate. And so they did. It was fine. The realtor, everybody else told her it was just fine because it passed those 2 tests, and it's not. And so it's again, buyer beware, right? And the last thing, probably one of the most important ones, would be to ask your neighbors and others that have been in the area for a while. They'll know, especially other people with wells. They'll know, they'll probably know some of them, especially some of the farmers in the area will know all 3 of the other drillers. If there's 3 drillers in your area, that sort of thing. Ask. It's also a good way to get to know your neighbors, or, those sorts of things. But it's important to not be shy about it and make sure that you're covered, because you're protecting quite an asset especially if you're drilling a new well. So would you drink it? This has never been asked before. No one's ever asked us, or asked me, if a well owner has under 10 pp of arsenic in their water, which the EPA limit for public water systems is 10, would you drink it? And so I'm answering for myself. And again, at the bottom, I said, I appreciate you asking this question. I would. And the thing everyone needs to understand, it's a lot more complicated question than that you have to really answer for yourself, because the arsenic standard is not set at 10 because that's what's safe. And I was actually, someone explained this to me better even today. It's a cross section, if you will, or a balance between what's safe and what's feasible. So there's risk in everything we do. I should just follow my text here. Like everything else in life, there's risk, right? Everything we do, we eat it, we drink. There's risk in driving. There's risk in taking a shower. And I learned in a class a long time ago that the black char on a steak on a grill, if you grill a steak and it gets all the fat on the outside gets black, that char is highly carcinogenic. And yet there's people, if you told them that's carcinogenic, don't eat that, they're going to tell you to go fly a kite, right? Because they think that's the best part. So what I will say is that the MCLG, which is the maximum contaminant level goal, is 0. That means the goal would be not to have any arsenic. That's the way to be completely safe. And that's true for many of the MCLs that are on that the EPA regulates. But it's a value that's based on the risk versus what's technologically and economically feasible. So you have to do an assessment about, and the way that's done, I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, is about, the 1 in 100,000 people that are more likely to get whatever this causes versus going to a lower level. So drinking water with 10 ppb of arsenic your whole life could affect some people. It may not affect others. I have people who are out in this area I mentioned earlier where we have high arsenic who look at me like, the health standard used to be 50 in 2006. Now we've lowered it to 10 and you're telling me that it's not safe, not necessarily safe. And it's just about risk. And so everyone needs to figure that out and investigate it on their own and decide what they're willing to risk. So, I grew up on an old well that when it rained hard, the water was cloudy. I drank out of a hose. Matter of fact, when I went to college and left home, 3 months later, after drinking city water for 3 months, I couldn't drink the water in our well anymore without getting sick because the bacteria that I'd gotten used to my whole life that are in that well, I didn't have in my stomach anymore. So, it's all relative to your situation and what you believe to protect your own health. It's a personal decision. So, and, I said here at the end, there is treatment for arsenic. And you should realize that if you're concerned about it, and if you really are and you're worried, and you have 8 parts per billion of arsenic in your water, you should add treatment, and it'll likely get rid of. You won't be able to detect it in all likelihood, depending on the chemistry, but it should take it down some more, I would believe. Okay, Dan, anything to add to that? By the way, I should.
No, that's good. Steve.
Okay. So how often should I shock chlorinate my well? Well, actually, it's a bad idea to put chlorine or Clorox or to shock chlorinate it on a schedule. You should only disinfect it when it needs it, and that's determined by sampling. So if you have bacteria in your well, then you should chlorinate it if it needs it. Also, we see bad advice all the time around this issue. I just had a well owner who told me that the contractor who came out to disinfect their well told him he didn't know for sure if he was doing it the right way. And it's a real issue nationwide. Well owners, I have a well owner up in Northern Illinois who told me that their contractor told them just to pour a cup of bleach in the well every month. That does nothing to help the well. In fact, it hurts the well because straight bleach is too concentrated and it affects the pitless adapter, the rubber seals, the brass fittings. It's an oxidant. It causes metals to be released. And so what we've done is we've looked at literally 70 or 80 different guides on how to disinfect a well. And we chose the one that we feel is the most appropriate for well owners across the country. And it's available on our website under Lesson 10, under Water Treatment Solutions and Class Resources. And I'll show you where that's at in a minute. But it's called the Well and Water System Disinfection for Private Wells. Now you can Google that and find it on Minnesota's website. But a couple years ago, they updated it and they made it much shorter. And they did that because the marketing folks there felt like it was necessary not to have such a long document. It's like 8 or 10 pages. We disagree. We think the old one's much better because it's step-by-step instructions. And if you're going to do this yourself and not have a contractor do it, you need to follow these instructions and make sure you're doing things the right way. So this is what it looks like. And again, it's available on our website. And we just kept an old copy. And here it tells you how much to put in. You mix the bleach with water so that the concentration you're putting in isn't too high to cause, oxidation I mentioned earlier. And then it goes through, may have scale buildup. There's all kinds of information here, even about turning off the power while you're doing this, and because you have electric wires running around and stuff like that. What to do with treatment equipment. It's really a good guide. And it mentions the Water Quality Association because they represent all the companies that make a lot of this treatment, and a lot of their for these devices, the owner's manuals may have information on whether they should be part of the treatment or not, the shot chlorination, and so they tell you whether to take it offline and things like that. So so I would use that. So there's another question, a follow-up here was, why do I have to shot chlorinate my well more than once if I use the proper dose of chlorine? And a lot of this came from Dan and Walt Kelly, but I put it all together here, and there's a couple other things I added. So there's really 4 things that could be going on. One, bacteria sometimes build up and form layers in a well, especially if you get it tested and you haven't done it for 25 years. It's really a slime layer or fairly thick. So when you chlorinate that, that chlorine's getting to the upper layer, but it's not necessarily able to get down all the way down to the well casing, if you will. And so some of that'll slough off then whenever you start pumping the well, but then they'll still be positive because you've got to go back and take out the rest of it, and it may take several times. It may take 3 or 4 times. The other thing that could be happening is there's a continuous source. So if, for instance, you may not realize it, you have a shallow dug well, you're not too far away from your septic system or your drainage field. So dug wells a lot of times work on the principle that they're using the water table, and you put in a large diameter well most of the time because there's no real aquifer available. So what we see a lot, especially in Illinois in our glaciated part of the state, is that these large diameter wells may be 30 to 40 feet deep, and that's a pretty deep one, and it's all soil and clay. But there's 1 or 2 places where there may be 3 inches of sand. That's just a little stream of sand that got laid down when the glaciers melted and all that stuff. That's where the water's all coming from. That little seam of sand could extend 100 yards in each direction, 5 yards in each direction, 3 miles in each direction. But if that's the only sand for that whole 30 or 40 feet is 3 inches, that's where all the water is going to flow. And so if your septic unit is discharging and getting some of that water is getting down to that thin sand, that's going to cause that problem. And we have seen that. So if you have a source and you keep disinfecting and you can't get rid of it, really the only thing you can do is add continuous disinfection. And that's either adding a chlorine pump to your line so that you're basically just like a community water supply, you have chlorinated water, and you can adjust that, so that it doesn't have a real bad taste or whatever, but you're still getting chlorine and you're disinfecting, or UV. And UV is becoming much more popular, especially for springs and things like in Southern Illinois and Indiana and Kentucky. And there's springs all over the country actually. But I just worked with someone north of Springfield, Illinois, who they have a dug well and they have this problem, and they decided to put in a UV unit. So that's what you'd need to do. So the third thing that could happen is that the chemistry of the water may be such that the pH is above 8. So, and I honestly didn't know this until about 2 years ago, that chlorine isn't effective above a pH of 8. And it also, when you put chlorinated water in a well, it raises the pH of the water. So if that's the case, there are alternatives. We don't have anything up on our website, and I'm not versed well enough in what those are, but I'm looking into it. And Virginia Tech researchers were the first folks to tell me about it, and they're doing some research now to look at what you need to do as a well owner. They're talking about developing even like a kit that would have pH strips and maybe something. I know in some places they use vinegar. That hasn't been tested or researched to see if that's safe to do or the right thing to do. But in some places out east, they use vinegar to lower the pH of the water in the well, and then you can add chlorine and it's more effective. So I bring that up because if your pH is above 8, then chlorine, you could, it takes like 100 times more chlorine after you get to a certain point to be effective. And that's just not a good idea, right? So hopefully we'll have some better answers if that's the case. But I guess the bottom line is, truthfully, you're wasting your time using chlorine if the pH is above 8, is what I've been told. by other experts. So, and the last thing is there could be other things in the water reacting with the chlorine. Dan, do you have any ideas like, what would that be? I mean, I guess just a higher dose isn't a big deal if, because if you can't smell it at the tap, that may not be there. I guess if the chlorine's being used up in the well because of other constituents.
Yeah, if it's, yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but people talk like, there's other things that chlorine can oxidize and react with. I suppose if you had a heavy dose of, organics or biological stuff, something that's causing maybe more than normal than what, maybe when they calculate this. Basically, you're looking for, I think, this is a guess, somebody might have a better answer, but I think I've seen before that they want between about 50 and 200 parts per billion of chlorine in the water.
Yeah, that's in the guide. I think it's 200 to 300, something like that.
Okay. But in generally, people will say a good guidance is to see if you can smell it. If you can't smell it, you should smell it at least a little bit, not super concentrated, but usually your nose is pretty sensitive. So
yeah, it makes perfect sense. When I read that, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So a little bit about the private well class. I already mentioned the 10 lessons. We do webinars like today. Some other things that we provide. Again, this is our web page. It says learn by audio, that's podcasts. Learn by video, those are both the webinars. And some short videos we put together. But for each lesson, like the first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. In addition to the PDF you get sent that's between 6 and 10 pages long, there's on our website in the resource library is this list of other resources. So if something we've written in our lesson isn't clear, you can look at some of these other sources, and they're actually fairly well used, and they're all free and publicly available from other sources. And some of them were actually used to help develop our class materials. And so just like on number 2 here, groundwater well contamination, if you're happen to be in an area with flowing wells where the water pressure is such that water flows out of the top of a well, we have a couple areas in Illinois, small areas like that, but in Michigan, they've got a lot of it. At one point, they were losing about 28 million gallons a day of well water to the surface, basically, because of flowing wells. So they passed a law that requires you to cap those. And this book has all the diagrams and information about how to cap a flowing well, as well as it's kind of the definitive handbook on flowing well issues. So it's pretty cool to look at if you're in that situation. I mentioned we do webinars there. So this one's called Well Care 101. We do webinar recordings for environmental health professionals, labs, real estate, septic system owners. You can see those over there. And this is the one we're doing today is really for well owners. We also do targeted ones like this one on lead, and we do one on septic systems. So I encourage you to, you can view this as a video. This particular webinar, we brought in Dr. Kelsey Piper, who's at Virginia Tech, and has done a ton of lead research. She's even involved with the Flint issues, but she's done a lot of work on lead in private wells. And in Virginia especially, some of their aquifers have pHs around 5.5, which makes that water more likely to be corrosive. And so they've seen some real lead issues out there that we don't see in Illinois. And so she was a guest and provided a lot of great information. And we also have a resource page that goes along with this. If you type in privatewellclass.org/lead, it'll take you to a page with some resources you can get to. I don't think I included that here. Yeah, I didn't. And we also have these short videos. They're 4 to 6 minutes long. What is a sand and gravel aquifer or well, and what is a bedrock well or aquifer? Why does my well keep losing pressure? So one of our videos called How Does My Pressure Tank Work? These went up in January of 2016. It has almost 300,000 hits already. And what that tells us is that a lot of folks have pressure problems or don't understand how their pressure tanks work, and that there's not a lot of good information out there. So this short video walks you through how that all works and in plain language, and we recommend you just take a look at those things. And again, this is all on YouTube and it's all freely available. So the goal of our private well class program, these webinars and our class and all the other materials we provide, is one, to help you understand why your well is important, why you need to understand how it works. It's really important to understand how it works whenever a problem occurs so you can ask the right questions. And then that also really helps you understand how to protect yourself from any risk from your drinking water. You know, in many cases, groundwater and well water is perfectly fine, but if you don't do the right things to take care of your well and to test to make sure that there aren't naturally occurring contaminants, you're putting yourself at risk for no reason. So that's the idea behind that. And really, it's what we hope in the end, especially after you've gone through our class, is that you understand your well log, why you need to know your well depth, your pump setting, if you have a screen or not, where your water's coming from. Is it coming from 10 feet down or 300 feet down? Really matters. So also what natural occurring contaminants might be in your area, how to learn to ask the better questions, as I've already mentioned, and then again, sample your well. It's important to do it regularly. So that's the webinar part of this. We do have some questions, and I'll pull those over. Hang on one second here. Okay. Well, that didn't work. Okay, let me, let's bring this up and make it full screen, and I'll make this a little larger. Okay, so first question, we have an older well. Will lead show up in annual testing if lead was used in the casing? So it's not typical to use lead in a well casing because it's too malleable. It bends too easy, which is why plumbers love it and why it was used for so long, because it's much easier to thread and everything else. We do see galvanized pipe sometimes, especially in the drop pipe, which is, you know, the pipe that either it goes down to your pump or that's, you know, pulling water up to your pump. So galvanized pipe has lead in it. And so it really depends on the pH of your water. So as an example, the Flint issue that everybody's heard about, you know, they've had lead pipes for 80 years or longer than that, and it was never a problem until they switched their water supply and the water became corrosive. They stopped using phosphates, which naturally raise the pH of the water and help protect from corrosive water issues, and they switched to a water supply that you know, led to, so there's two things that happen, and Dan's better at this than I am, but either it's a corrosive water, I guess three, it could be neutral, but it's very unusual, or it's scale forming, which means on those lead pipes, like in Flint, there was scale buildup, and when they switched water supplies, all that scale went away, and then they started leaching lead out of their pipes. So the only way to know is to test. But when you do that, you should also test for pH and get an idea of, you know, and alkalinity, I think. Dan, what else should you test for if you really want to know the aggressiveness of your water?
Yeah, there's some equations they're kind of complicated to use, but some of the things that are common are pH and dissolved solids are probably the biggest things to look for, but there's some other things that can balance it, like you said, alkalinity, but there's certain different situations, and it gets more complicated than I'm not really an expert at the corrosion, but pH and the dissolved solids are good things if it's higher. I think that's what happened with Flint, if I remember correctly. They switched to perhaps a smaller water source, so maybe there was, I think they were guessing there was more
well, they switched
runoff.
they switched to a river supply, and they were
Right.
using Detroit water before that, I think. So,
and it was more
Okay.
susceptible to chloride contamination and stuff like that, which increased corrosivity because the dissolved solids increased. I think
Sure.
is what the explanation was.
Okay, so the next question is, I forgot to ask beforehand, is about well registration. How important is it that I register my well with my county? Okay, we need to know what state you're in, and we could look into this, but every state is different. In Illinois, drillers have to file a permit with the county before the well's ever drilled, and when the well is drilled, the county comes out and inspects it, sometimes during construction, and then after the well is drilled, it has to be tested for 3 or 4 things, I think, And once it's passed those tests, then the driller files a log with the county, and that registers the well. So if you're supposed to register your well on your own, unless this is a question about a well that you know doesn't have a log, and I don't know that there's any requirement to do it. Certainly not in Illinois, but we'd need to know what state you're in order to get you a better answer. And we can talk to someone for ourselves and then get back to you, even if you want to send us your contact information. And because it may be important, depending on what water law is in your state and things like that. Okay, so I'm gonna make this even a little bigger, I think. Okay, on my last analysis regarding nitrates, it showed results of 0.214 milligrams per liter. There was a column for report limit at 0.05. It also showed MCL at 10. I interpreted this as the well below the 10. Am I reading this correctly? Well, if the actual result was 0.214, then the MCL, milligrams per liter, the MCL is 10 milligrams per liter. So that would be 1/50th of the MCL. As far as the column that had reporting limit. Okay.
Yeah, it's just like it's similar
That's
to
how low they can
limit.
detect. Yeah, that's the detection limit. I misread that. You're probably sitting there waiting to chomping at the bit to answer that, weren't you?
Go ahead. I'll find.
So the report limit means that's how low they can detect it. So just like on the samples I showed earlier where ours said less than, we put a less than symbol, and then that value is our detection limit, which means
this is slightly different. It's very similar, but it's just they might have a detection limit that's a little lower than that, but that's the limit that they report at. So
sure.
So it's getting to the same concept. That's a lower level that you're not going to see. It'll be a less than, something like that.
Sure. All right. I have an older well. It appears the screen on the bottom must be compromised since I see some sand in the toilet bowl. Do I drill a new well or just filter out the sand? Filtering out the sand is a slippery slope. It may, it depends on how much sand there is, but if your well screen's compromised, then depending on how big your well is, if it's, maybe a 6-inch well, for instance, they may be able to go in and put a liner through it and put in basically a well inside a well. But it's something you need to talk to a well professional about. That's not something that I've ever dealt with. But if it's just a little bit of sand over a lot of water use, then, it might be worth putting a filter in front of if you have a softener or whatever you might have, and see. But if it takes 3 days for it to get full, then obviously that's a bigger problem. And it's a little bit of an expense to figure that out. Any other advice, Dan?
No, not really. It's a good question. I get sand. I get a small amount of sediment in my well, but not really a lot of sand. And I think some small amount is probably common sometimes. I mean, you hear about people raising the pumps, but then there's I'm hesitant to give you that advice out or anything.
Well, yeah, that's a good point though. So it could be that your well intake for your pump is close to the screen. If you're sure you have a well screen, if you have an older well, if it's a large diameter well, it probably doesn't have a screen. And so if there's plenty of water in your well, you may be able to just raise the pump up some, or your drop pipe some, so that it's not as close to the bottom. And it may solve the issue totally. Because the other concern, I was just thinking, I had another well owner here who had some sand, and they had problems with, it'll wear out your pump. Sand's very abrasive. And in this case, they had galvanized pipes in their home, and at one of the elbows, it basically wore out the galvanized and popped a hole in their pipes in their house because the sand's so that abrasive. And so, if you understand, I guess if it's really a sand and gravel well, if you've got enough water volume and head, you might be able to raise the intake for your pump up, or your pump if it's if it's submersible at the bottom, to do that. Otherwise, yeah, that's a good point, Dan. But yeah, they'll ruin your pump and sand.
Yeah, it is a good question. I just want to point out something I said before. If you do want to filter it, I know wells are expensive, so if I were gonna drill a new well, you can't. I don't want to say that the best solution is put a filter, but it's just a good idea to maybe put a filter in there anyway, just to protect your water treatment equipment or your pipes, like Steve was saying, if the sand was causing extra corrosion because of the abrasiveness of it. Sediment filters are cheap.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it may just be that if some of the sands build up in the bottom of the well, and it's so it's close enough to the intake now that you're starting to see it, and so you may be able to raise your pump up, or your pump, your drop pipe for your pump up. So,
and just another quick thing, and I don't know really if there's much validity to this, but it seems like sometimes people will have sand and sometimes they won't. So it makes me wonder, like if a pressure tank, if there's any settling, I don't really know. I'm guessing there's probably not, like in the bladder or something, but yeah.
Well, you want to stop it before it gets to your pressure tank. Yeah, right. Otherwise, it's just going to build up in there. So, okay. If proper instructions are followed for shocking a well, what other steps can be followed to remove bacteria?
I assume it means that there's still bacteria present.
Yeah, I think we covered that with the other.
Yeah, I think so.
Question. Because I'm not,
like there might be you might have to go to continuous treatment. Yeah, you covered a lot of that before.
Yeah, no, I think so. I'm going to assume that question came before we answered that. Okay, so Dan, number 6 is for you. What is the orange iron bacteria or rust bacteria in well water, and is it harmful?
Yeah, I'm not a bacteria expert, but you hear a lot about iron bacteria, and bacteria that grows and feeds on the iron in the well. It's lots of questions. Is it iron or is it iron bacteria? I think generally the way they say you can tell the difference is the iron bacteria is more filamentous, and precipitated iron is more like a powder that'll fall out of solution. It might be clear at first. I've never really seen anything that says iron bacteria is harmful, so there might be different opinions or something I'm missing, but generally I've not considered it harmful.
Okay. Yeah, it's very common, I know that. So, and this last question then, can you post a link to the step-by-step chlorination on your website? So Katie's put up privatewellclass.org/lesson-10, and I'll go there and just show you. So here's lesson 10, water treatment solutions, and the 4th one on the list is water disinfection for private wells. Okay. Yeah, and this document that we talked about before. But if I go back to the main page, go to home, if you go to privatewellclass.org and go over resource library, lesson 10 is right there. So water treatment solutions. And then when you click on that, here we go, same thing. So all those resources are available. Okay, well, hey, for those of you who stuck around, thank you very much. If you have any other questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. Katie's got a note here. There's our email address, info@privatewellclass.org. And also on the bottom of our webpage is a phone number. If something comes up later and you have a question, or you can, like I said, you can always email us. And yeah, and if you do have something that's specific to your state or jurisdiction, please email us and give us the more information, and we'd be glad to look into it for you. I know before California changed their law, there were a number of well owners that I worked with where no one can get their well log from their county except the well owner themselves. And so I had to wait for the well owner to go to the county office and get their well log, and then they faxed it to me so that I could give them some assistance. And so it's just different everywhere. And that's part of the problem with private wells, is that every state handles them differently. You know, it has different rules, and so it makes it a little complicated. So, well, thank you again, and that will end our webinar for today.